got the body out onto the kitchen table, and took many detailed photos. As a result of this, she then got the photos to the British Embassy. We were able to get those photos to the University of Glasgow Pathology Department, where the chief pathologist, who now incidentally is the UK's chief pathologist, said on the basis of these photos that the gentleman had died from immersion in boiling liquid, and it was immersion rather than splashing, because there was a clear tide line around the top of the arms and the upper torso, and beneath that there was 100% burning, complete coverage. We raised this case with the Uzbek authorities, and they said that the two prisoners who had died in a fight with a kettle. They'd been making a cup of tea and fighting and splashed each other with the kettle. That was the official explanation, and that's kind of the the standard of Uzbek government propaganda, if you like. And there was an interesting sequel, because the mother was sentenced, Mrs. Mohidirova. She was 69 years old. She was sentenced to 7 years hard labour for having taken the photographs to the British Embassy. In the end, pressure from the Embassy, managed to get that sentence reduced to a fine, which we in fact paid. But that's a quite appalling case, but it's not at all unusual. I mean, I've never seen people completely boiled to death before, but insertion of limbs in boiling liquid is a torture quite regularly used. And as I say, it's effective. People confess. 99% of these trials end in conviction. Almost no one is ever found not guilty. I've never come across a case of someone being found not guilty in an Uzbek trial, and they confess because they're beaten until they can't stand it anymore. I attended a trial in my first couple of weeks in Uzbekistan. A gentleman called Hudabaginov, who with 5 others was charged of membership of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, of links to Al-Qaeda, and a whole string of other charges. And the trial was completely farcical. And one of the most interesting things about it, I went along myself and sat in court the day of the trial, was that the judge made a number of completely random anti-Islamic remarks for no apparent reason in the course of the trial. At one stage, he said to the prisoners, "How could you understand each other talking when you all have such long beards?" And then he started laughing, and all the officials and cronies in the court started laughing too, as though this was a great joke. And again, on very similar lines, he again, just in the middle of a trial, for no particular reason, stood up and shouted at them and said, "How could you find time to commit so many crimes when you have to pray 5 times a day?" And again, the court officials, everyone laughed as though this was a hilarious joke, and just being there was absolutely horrible. It was like, it reminded me of television pictures I've seen of Hitler's show trials. It really was like that. And another old gentleman came to give evidence, and he had signed a witness statement to say that 2 of the accused, who were his nephews, had links with Osama bin Laden, had been to see Osama bin Laden and that kind of thing. And suddenly, he was obviously terrified. Suddenly he found defiance, and the old man stood up and said, "This is all not true. They tortured my children in front of me until I admitted to this. We don't know anything about Osama bin Laden. We are a family of small farmers from Andijan. What have we got to do with Osama bin Laden?" And I was very close to him when he did this, and you could just tell he was telling the truth. And actually, these people had no connection with Osama bin Laden at all. But the whole show trial idea was part of the Uzbek government's attempt to portray any Muslim, any pious Muslim, and portray any political opponent as linked to Osama bin Laden. The Americans, of course, are very happy to believe this because they have a big military base in Uzbekistan. They give Uzbekistan $120 million a year in military aid, about $80 million a year in security service aid. They really prop up this regime. So it suits them to have all this false evidence that all the opposition are linked to Osama bin Laden. It's hard to describe just how horrible the situation is. It really is. It's a living nightmare for the people there.
I have heard that in Uzbekistan there's this thing about the so-called ghost plane. Are you aware of such thing?
In my time there, I was aware that the Americans were flying people back from Afghanistan, in particular, from Bagram to Uzbekistan. Were bringing back Uzbek prisoners, and I was very much aware that these people would be handed over to the SNB, the Uzbek secret police, and almost certainly would be tortured. And there were a couple of cases where I was involved with the families in trying to discover what had happened to the people, because obviously if they were killed, they would tend to just disappear from the system. There'd be no official notification they'd been murdered or tortured to death or whatever very often. So I was aware of that. What I didn't know at the time, though it now appears to be true, was that the CIA weren't only bringing back Uzbeks from Afghanistan, they were also bringing other nationals to Uzbekistan specifically in order to be tortured. There seems to be an awful lot of good information on that now being gathered by American journalists in particular. There's been a great deal of investigative reporting. And it does appear that these movals of detainees around the world in order to be tortured included bringing non-Uzbeks to Uzbekistan. But I couldn't pretend I knew that at the time. I knew people were being brought in, but I kind of presumed they were just Uzbeks. That was bad enough because of what was going to happen to them. But now, of course, we know it was all part of a much wider CIA operation.
So what was the reaction of the Foreign Office when you reported it to them, and the CIA when you conveyed this message to the CIA station?
Well, the Foreign Office were fairly hostile to me from a fairly early stage when I started telling them bad things about the Karimov regime and also saying that I couldn't understand why the Americans in particular were giving such strong support to this regime. I was viewed as rocking the boat, and I was told, directly told, that London thought I was being unpatriotic and not supporting the war on terror. When London really started getting hostile was when I started saying that MI6 didn't ought to be accepting intelligence from the Uzbek security services because it had been got under torture. And at that stage, London sort of reached a new level of hostility, if you like. I first of all spoke with the CIA in Tashkent. I actually asked my deputy to go and call on the American embassy and say to them, look, we're getting this intelligence from MI6 that's come from the CIA, from the Uzbek intelligence services. We think it's got under torture. She'd reported back to me that she'd been to see the CIA at the American embassy, and they'd said that they didn't see any problem with it being with torture. As far as the CIA were concerned, torture was part of the game now, post-September the 11th. Obviously I found that fairly shocking. So I went back to London, complained about intelligence obtained under torture, and also I said that the intelligence was rubbish anyway. It was all this stuff saying that, Hizb ut-Tahrir are connected to Al-Qaeda and the Uzbek opposition are connected to